Here we are in the Cibolo National Forest, east of Gallup, New Mexico, just under 8,000 feet elevation. Magnificent trees here, and young ones too. They're doing very well here. This kind of juniper is called Juniperus depiana. You can remember it as, just think of it as Johnny Depp for short.
Welcome to episode 7 of Climate, Trees, and Legacy. I'm Connie Barlow. Today is the spring equinox, March 20th, 2015. Now, all of the videos that you're going to see in this program on Alligator Juniper were recorded last summer, 2014. This is the first episode in my Climate, Trees, and Legacy series that I'm putting together in 2015. There'll be a number to come. Last year I did 6 along the course of the Great March for Climate Action. My husband and I were speaking in behalf of Action for Climate Change along the route of the marchers last year. And so the previous 6 episodes all followed that route. Let me give you a brief introduction to each one of them. Episode 1 was filmed in Colorado, and that's the introduction to this series. The basic premise is that outside of conservation biology research that's concerned with particular species, particularly endangered species, those who are working with forests, and that is the trees, the canopy trees of forests, both in a conservation and a practical sense, that is the foresters, are recognizing that this century they're going to be in deep trouble. And that is that the forest trees, particularly the big seeded trees, cannot move north fast enough to keep pace with climate change. They're going to be left behind. And we'll be facing in the latter decades of this century places in this country that used to have forests, but where the forest trees are gone. So we're going to need to start assisting the migration of forest trees northward. It's a very controversial topic, not so much among foresters, but certainly in the realm of conservation, where even wild trees, non-threatened, non-endangered trees, are going to have to be helped to move north. The climate is just changing too quickly. So that was the premise of episode 1. Now, as I've moved across, I've taken a single species in general. The first one, episode 2, was Lessons of Torrey Pine. Torrey Pine is in Southern California. Episode 3 was Lessons of Joshua Tree, and it was filmed in the Mojave Desert of California and Arizona. Episode 4 was Lessons of Arizona Cypress, and this was filmed in Sedona, Arizona. Arizona cypress is very much restricted to the American Southwest and reaching down into Mexico. Episode 5, now here I broke from the sequence of doing a single species as we followed the climate marchers eastward across the country. When I got to Colorado, I'd already known that the devastation of climate change and the bark beetles that have been released as a result of too warm winters meant that I was going to need to cover a number of species. So episode 5, Rocky Mountain Trees in Climate Peril, was filmed in Colorado, and it dealt with actually 10 species of trees. Episode 6 was the first one I did after crossing the Mississippi. Across the Mississippi, I really wanted to deal with the 100th anniversary of the extinction of North America's wild passenger pigeons. Passenger pigeons used to be a primary disperser of big seeded trees of eastern North America, and that includes beech and all of the oaks. So episode 6 was titled Becoming Passenger Pigeon. So here we are, 2015, Alligator Juniper, and this time it's not Lessons of Alligator Juniper. I call it Assisted Range Expansion of Alligator Juniper, because this is the first common species that I've taken symbolic and research action with. That is, actually experimenting with moving seeds of alligator juniper well north of its current range. And that means moving it from New Mexico up to Colorado. So that's the theme of this Climate, Trees, and Legacy episode. First, let's delve into what's meant by assisted range expansion. And for that, we're going to take a look at a triad of charts conceived by Canadian and U.S. foresters a couple years ago that's making a real difference in distinctions in the amount of human assistance needed for assisted migration of forest trees in this century of rapid climate change. Let's take a look at that chart. On the left, you see an example of what they call assisted population migration. In the middle is assisted range expansion, and on the far right is assisted species migration. Let's take a look in detail at each one and the tree examples given. First, assisted population migration. What's meant by this is that you're not moving the range of the tree, that is where the tree already exists. All you're doing is taking seeds from more southerly populations and moving those seeds northward whenever there's a fire or a logging operation, or simply to experiment to see whether those seeds can actually do better in the decades ahead of rapid climate warming. You're not shifting the range at all. It's a pretty much standard operation that's been involved in Canada's Forest Service for quite a while. So that's the least controversial form of assisted migration. That is, you're helping the genotypes, the more southerly adapted genotypes, move into the species' more northerly latitudes, or uphill in the case of mountains. The example given here is western larch. Let's take a look at western larch. Here's a photograph taken in the autumn. For those of us who are Easterners, we know this related species, same genus, Larix, by the term tamarack. And it's the only conifer we have in the north that's deciduous. That is, that turns yellow in the fall, drops its needles, and then regrows needles in the spring. It's a very, very beautiful tree in the west. And it's also valuable for timber harvest in Canada in particular. So what's happening is that there's already experimentation going on. Again, taking a look at this chart, with moving the seeds of western larch that grow in the Pacific Northwest states of the USA, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and taking those seeds and planting them up into British Columbia. That's assisted population migration. Not very controversial in Canada in particular. Moving to the more controversial form, and the one we're going to be dealing with in this episode for alligator juniper, is what foresters call assisted range expansion. And you can see in this chart here that what you're doing is that you're actually taking some seeds and moving it slightly beyond where its current existing range is. That is, you're taking some seeds from somewhere and you're moving it northward into where there are no individuals of that species growing in the wild. There may be some in landscaping and so forth. People have moved around a lot. But in terms of wild forests, they're really not there yet. So the example given in this chart is ponderosa pine. And I'll show you a picture of the trunk of ponderosa pine. Widespread species in the western USA. I like showing its trunk. It's so characteristic, the orange color, and you can absolutely identify ponderosa pine if you have any questions. All you need to go is you go up to the trunk, put your nose right in it, and so long as it's not the dead of winter, you'll be able to smell the vanilla smell of the sap in the tree. It's just lovely. So take a look at the chart again, ponderosa pine. This is an experiment already going on, and what makes it controversial is see where the provincial boundary is there. Ponderosa pine occurs in the wild. It's quite widespread in British Columbia, but it does not yet occur in the wild in Alberta. So the foresters in Alberta are actively experimenting with moving ponderosa pine in for the reason that their lodgepole pine that's dominant in this more interior, colder landscape than British Columbia, it's been knocked out by pine beetles, bark beetles. And so the thought is that if you move ponderosa pine in to a more northern extent from its own range, it's going to be able to survive well for the next few decades, maybe half a century or so. So again, this is assisted range expansion, and this is what we're going to be looking at as human assistance for alligator juniper, just moving it northward of its current range. But let's take a look at the third and the most controversial one. It's called assisted species migration. That's actually a great term for it. And the case study example given here is a species of conifer related to yew called Florida torreya. And Florida torreya has existed in historic time only in the panhandle of Florida, along the Apalachicola River and reaching a little bit up into Georgia. And what's been happening is a group of citizens, led by me, starting back in 2004 when the late Pleistocene ecologist Paul S. Martin and I co-authored a paper saying, "Move Torreya taxifolia north now." And since then, a group of us citizens have been doing it. And you can see by the arrows here some of the places where we have moved it, where we're thinking of moving it. And thus far, it's doing fabulously in North Carolina. It's barely hanging on in Florida in its native range. It's doing very well, producing seeds in North Carolina. It's not doing that in Florida. And we're also experimenting as far north as Michigan, and even we'll probably do New Hampshire this year as well. Not because we think it's going to survive there, but we need to find out what its northernmost range is in this climate, because climate may warm so fast that if we can get as many things as possible to their northernmost range, then that'll be really helpful in giving them a better chance of surviving this century of rapid climate change. So let's take a look again at that middle chart, assisted range expansion. That's what we're going to be considering for the rest of this episode for alligator juniper. For some people, you might consider the reason to move alligator juniper north is simply as an experiment. Let's see how far north we can get it now where it can start to grow. It's a very slow growing species. It takes about 50 years to mature, even under good conditions, before it'll start to produce the next generation of seeds. So let's see how far north we can get it. So it's an experiment. And in another way, it's like, we've got to start doing this. You can't just last minute decide, oh my gosh, alligator juniper needs to move north. We need to actually start moving it in increments now. So it's both an experiment and the first example of possibly moving it somewhere where it can survive now and well into the decades that follow. So let's begin with a tour of the sister species of alligator juniper. There'll be 5 in the western part of the United States, at least are of concern to us. And then I'll also talk about the one that's very prominent in the eastern United States. But let's just get a sense of genus Juniperus. So take a look at this chart. On this chart, you'll see the 5 that are in the western USA and Canada, some of which are in Canada. Starting from the first one in the chart, that's the lowest elevation generally occurring. Down to the bottom is the highest elevation occurring. You'll notice that Juniperus depiana, Johnny Depp, alligator juniper, is in the middle of the 5. So starting off with Juniperus monosperma, that's one seed juniper, and that occurs at the lowest elevations between 5,000 and 7,500 feet. Take a look at this map here. This is the one seed juniper, the monosperma, and now I'm going to flip to the Utah juniper and kind of back and forth between these two so that you can see there is some overlap between the two in Arizona. Now here, for comparison, is the Alligator Juniper. And notice how the Alligator Juniper stretches far down into Mexico, but you can bet that as it goes down there, it has to climb into much higher elevations. So climate change is certainly most threatening to Alligator Juniper varieties down in Mexico than it is up in the United States. But nonetheless, we're going to look at assisted range expansion in the USA for Alligator Juniper. Now, just to get a sense of how dense and compact and untree-like, more like a shrub, the one seed and the Utah juniper are, I'll show you a few photographs. This first one is in Arizona. It was taken in the Sedona area. That's probably Utah juniper, as is the next one, taken in the Prescott area. That is also probably Utah juniper. It might be one seed. This final photograph, though, I know is the one seed. I took this up on a drive up from Santa Fe up into the San Luis Valley, and that's looking eastward at the Sangre de Cristos, and all of those shrubby green mounds there would be the one seed juniper. Again, that's the lowest elevation. You would not see Alligator juniper in there. So let's compare Alligator juniper, elevations 6,500 to 8,000 feet in general, with the species that I most encounter when I'm taking a look at Alligator juniper, and that's the Rocky Mountain juniper that exists from about 7,000 to 9,000 feet, and often where the two overlap, the Rocky Mountain juniper will be the one in the more of a ravine, wetter, shadier ravine, and the Alligator juniper will be out exposed in the open. But let's take a look at this Rocky Mountain juniper and see where we find it on the map. Wow, look at it, goes way up into Canada there. It's in New Mexico, it's in Arizona, virtually everywhere where you're going to be finding the Alligator juniper in the USA. You'll notice, though, it does not go down into Mexico. It's also in Colorado quite a bit as well. And for comparison, back and forth here, you see the Rocky Mountain juniper with the Alligator juniper maps. All right, this is unmistakable. I find that the leaf forms of the Rocky Mountain juniper are sometimes kind of bluish, as the Alligator juniper tends to be, and a little bit finer, not as dense, but you can definitely tell the two by take a look at the bark of the Rocky Mountain juniper. The one seed juniper also has bark this way as well, as does the Utah juniper, but where the two overlap in range, unmistakable. You'll see some videos later on where they occur in the same neighborhood. So here is the bark of the Rocky Mountain juniper, and here's the bark of the Alligator juniper. Here's some seeds you can see in the snow of Rocky Mountain juniper. And I also have a comparison of the branchlets and seeds. They're called juniper berries. They're not really berries, but there's anywhere from 1 to 5 seeds in genus Juniperus, surrounded by a fleshy body that constitutes the fruit. So on the far left is the Rocky Mountain juniper in this picture, the branchlets and the seed. In the center is the Alligator juniper, and the far right, you can see how denser that the leaf structure is. That's the one seed juniper there. So back to our chart, we've looked at everything there except the highest elevation one at the bottom of the chart, Juniperus communis, dwarf juniper. And this is amazing. It's actually circumpolar. Let's take a look at the map. First of all, you find it from 8,500 to 11,500 feet elevation. It occurs from Alaska to New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and actually elsewhere around the northern latitudes of the northern hemisphere. You actually see it up there in tundra habitats as well. Because what this juniper does, in fact, let's take a look at it now and then we'll go back to the map. What this juniper does is it occupies places where it doesn't have to grow tall, where it won't be shaded out by higher canopy trees, but it will have the protection from wind, will be covered by snow in the wintertime. This first photograph, you can see other canopy conifers down beneath it, but this is a very windy area that it's just kind of occupying a notch in the rock. This is at about 9,400 feet in Colorado. I took this picture last year. Now take a close-up look. Here are the branchlets of this dwarf juniper. Very distinctive from the other junipers, except not distinctive when the other junipers are not much more than seedlings. This is actually the form that all the junipers have in their branchlets when they're first growing out of the seed up to maybe 6 or 10 inches tall or so, and then only after that point do they switch over into the more scalar type of leaf structures. So again, here's the map of the dwarf juniper, and compare that to the alligator juniper, and you can see that there is overlap, of course, in the alpine areas, but you really will not find them overlapping at all in terms of occupying the same habitat. Much different elevations. Now, finally, for Easterners, I want to show you the juniper you know. It tends to be called the red cedar, and it's Juniperus virginiana. It is not a cedar, but it's called a red cedar. It's a Juniperus. It's a juniper. It's found all over the place. Here's a picture of one that I took in, I think it was in eastern Iowa I took this picture. And here's a close-up of the leaflets and berries. So turning back to alligator juniper, let's take a close look at the berries. Let's take a look at the seeds that it has. Now the question for foresters is how far and how fast can the alligator juniper disperse on its own? Two aspects to that. One is what's the maturation time between generations. Let's say if you have to move, 500 miles north over the next 50 years or so, how many generations do you get to do that in? Well, for alligator juniper, basically one if you're lucky. Maturation time is so slow for it. The second question, though, is who will disperse it if we humans don't? Can we rely on natural seed dispersal? Well, all the junipers require animals for dispersal, both the quadrupeds and the birds. Take a look first here at, it was just wonderful that I actually found this. When I was in Sedona walking along a canyon bottom, I found this, probably a coyote, maybe a fox, but you can absolutely see those juniper seeds there in the turd. So the coyotes, the foxes, they swallow the seeds whole. The digestive system takes away the fleshy part of it. For some seasons of the year, it provides a lot of important nutrition for the foxes and coyotes. Now they can carry it not as far as you would think birds do. Juniper is incredibly attractive to certain kinds of birds, especially those that don't have gizzards. The robins throughout the USA, the Townsend solitaire pictured here. I took this picture in Colorado last winter. The problem is that it runs through the digestive system of a bird very, very quickly. They get a lot of energy very quickly out of it. I read a paper that says that the average juniper seed in a Townsend solitaire in the wintertime will spend only about 12 minutes there before being either defecated out or spit out. And actually that's what I witnessed. This Townsend solitaire would go back and forth from the top of this tree down to the most fruiting juniper, and about every 15 minutes or so. So even though birds could carry the juniper seeds farther, I mean they can fly vast distances, because of their digestive systems are so quick, the foxes and the coyotes may be just as important as seed disperser, and nobody may do very long seed dispersal. for the juniper species. Okay, so let's take a close-up look at current range of alligator juniper. And now let's map it onto another system that's been trying to model how you can take temperature, rainfall, time of first frost, a whole lot of different variables. And just working with the variables, can you find that it overlaps with the current range? So the U.S. Forest Service researchers have models of alligator juniper and other tree species. And this is what they show for its current range. Pretty close. Now this is important to establish a baseline for a model, because what you're going to see happening is we're going to be putting in the climate predictions through this next century and seeing how the physiological range, the bioclimatic envelope it's called, would move given different climate scenarios, and therefore how fast and where alligator juniper needs to move to. But you can see this is what the current range would be. Now, before we take a look at how the U.S. Forest Service thinks the range of alligator juniper is going to shift over this century, I'd like to show you the places where I took videos of live wild alligator junipers now in their context in Arizona and New Mexico. So take a look at the map here. These are the first places. The yellow stars are the places where I took pictures where the alligator juniper exists. The blue star exists, but I also collected seeds there. I'll talk a lot about that one, and I'll have a lot more pictures there. And the purple star way up at the top, that's in southern Colorado, and that's where I took those seeds collected at the blue star and moved them up into Colorado as an example of assisted range expansion for alligator juniper owing to expected climate change. So let's move to the research. Let's move to the climate modeling that's already been done by the U.S. Forest Service at the Moscow, Idaho Forest Science Laboratory. Now up there, the researchers have put together climate models showing current range and where the best habitat for the tree is going to move to over the course of this century. They've done it for 76 species. You can see in this slide here, I've got 2 columns of it. But in order for you to see, here's what it looks like. You'll see alligator juniper. It's in alphabetical order by common name, and you can see alligator juniper there at the top. But looking carefully at this page called Plant Species and Climate Profile Predictions, there's some superstructure there that tells us what the options are for using this. It's not meant for regular citizens to use, but it is possible for us to do it. We simply have to click on the PNG files rather than the zip files. The PNGs are the maps, and then choose one of the climate predictions. I use the Canadian Centre for Climate Modeling and Analysis, and I chose the mid-range climate modeling. As you can see, it's this green line. It's not worst case scenario, but frankly it seems like we're getting closer to worst case scenario the longer things drag on without any significant reductions in our fossil fuel use. But the mid-range scenario is that bright green one, and that presumes that we do level off in carbon dioxide emissions going into the atmosphere by the end of this century, and it levels off at about 720 parts per million, including any trigger points. That means that, for example, permafrost starts melting and methane goes up, which ultimately turns into carbon dioxide and so forth. So even if we do just put in, let's say, 550 parts per million, it could ultimately get up to 720 parts per million before it levels off. Incidentally, right now, we're a little over 400 parts per million that are up there. So that's a basic science research we're going to start with, and here's how the foresters have used it, species by species. In this case, we're just going to look at Alligator Juniper, and then we'll take a look at a couple of the other junipers as well. Starting off with the current range, I'm going to show the map that actually has the whole western USA in it. And there's going to be a reason that we're doing that for, and it's because something happens in Idaho worth noting. Starting off today, current range. Now moving to 2030, what's the estimate for where the bioclimatic envelope, where Alligator Juniper ought to be in 2030? And that's where you see Idaho lighting up. Notice as well the front range, the Denver area, the Rocky Mountains lighting up as well. Again, let me move back for a moment to the current range. Watch Idaho, watch Colorado light up. 2030. This is going to be new habitat opening up for them. The red zone is the most favorable. The greenish yellow is somewhat favorable zone. But when you see red, that means excellent habitat. When you see kind of yellowish green, it's starting to dwindle. Maybe the mature trees could live there, but not new growth probably. So 2030, that's what we see. Let's take a look at 2060. 2060. Front range kind of goes away. New Mexico's almost gone. Now when we move to 2090, we're back in the front range. Idaho is even stronger in 2090. I've seen this in a number of species with the 76 species, that there's something that goes on with the leveling off process in the climate models toward the end of the century, where 2060 and 2090 don't seem quite right. But nonetheless, what we do know, the basics that we know, is that sometime this century, the current range of Alligator Juniper, which is right now Arizona, New Mexico, is going to move into Colorado, the front range, and even up into Idaho. That's where it will be capable of growing. The question is, will it get there? Will it get there? And that's human-assisted range expansion, which we're talking about. But let's take another look at these maps in sequence. Focus first just on Arizona. You'll see that the Mogollon Rim, that's where you see the red in there in Arizona in 2030, 2060, and 2090. Arizona is going to hang in there. New Mexico is where the losses are going to be great of Alligator Juniper. It's probably because their mountains aren't quite as high. The Alligator Juniper can't simply just cruise up the mountains. But let's take a look. Focus on New Mexico when I go through the same thing. Here's the current. Focus on New Mexico. 2030, 2060, 2090. And so that's why I chose to collect seeds from New Mexico, the Sandia Peak east of Albuquerque, and move it pretty much directly northward up into the south central part of Colorado, the east side of the San Luis Valley on the slope of Mount Blanca. Now, before I show the videos of each of these sites where it is now, where I collected the seeds, and where I planted the seeds in Colorado, let's take a look at a couple of the other juniper species and just get a sense of whether Alligator Juniper is an aberration, or whether the other junipers are also going to be doing a lot of moving this century. Again, Alligator Juniper is the only one I'm focusing on, but let's just take a look at its sister species and see what the forest researchers predict for those species during this century as well. Starting off with Rocky Mountain Juniper, this is the current range. Again, the red is the best, green, yellow is not so good. Let's move to 2030. 2060. 2090. Again, here's the current, 2030, 2060, 2090. Let's take a look at one seed juniper. look how restricted that is to Arizona and New Mexico, though it also has some up in Colorado right now. This is the one-seed juniper. This is current, 2030, 2060, 2090. Very strange. Notice how it's showing a presence just off the Rocky Mountains in as far north as Montana.